Hello and welcome back to Codex Lee. My name is Lee and this is a channel all about books. So I want to discuss two horror novels today. One published in the mid-1980s and set in that time. Another published in 2016 but set in the mid-1950s, both in the United States. These are two of the books that I read for the 5 Decades of Horror Challenge, and I thought there was a lot of value in looking at them together. So that's what I'm going to do. Now, given that both of these books were written by white men, it's worth me saying that my prior belief on this was that it is difficult to write with sensitivity and understanding about racism if you have not experienced racism firsthand yourself. And this was a belief of mine that was reinforced when I read the highly problematic graphic novel Habibi by Craig Thompson. So this is a work that, as one critic put it, and I'm quoting, it mythologizes the Middle East into something that is much more like an American perspective on Arab culture rather than an accurate or sensitive depiction of the communities there, end quote. So I think this is always a problem when you're writing about cultures and communities to which you don't belong, especially when the portrayal of those cultures and communities has been dominated by caricatures for so long. How do you tell someone else's story without further marginalizing them? So Thinner, written by Richard Bachman, who is actually Stephen King and was revealed to be Stephen King shortly after this book was published, was released in 1984, and it binds the legal sleaze anti-hero Billy Halleck to a Romani community via a curse inflicted by that community's patriarch, a man named Tadeusz Lemke. A curse that, as the title implies, forces Billy to lose weight at an uncontrollable rate. And this is intended as an act of vengeance after Billy kills Lemke's daughter when he was driving, shall we say, with undue care. And then he escapes prosecution through a combination of ties within the legal community and some good old-fashioned racism. So I've talked before on this channel about the unrelenting sexism in Stephen King's published works, at least the early works that I've read. I haven't talked quite so much about the racism because in part it's not quite as prevalent, but that's not to say that it's not present. I mean, at best you could describe characters such as Dick Hallorann from The Shining or Speedy Parker and the Talisman as crude caricatures. And don't get me started on the anti-Semitism in Pet Sematary. In Thinner, though, King situates race relations at the heart of the novel. I mean, this is very much an existential clash between a privileged white man and a marginalized community. The thing is that, whatever Stephen King is trying to say here about the plight of the Romani in the modern United States is lost for two reasons. Firstly, events are portrayed exclusively through Billy's perspective. And secondly, the Romani themselves are mostly there to serve as a plot device. So the idea for the story occurred to King when he went to see his doctor, and his doctor instructed him to lose weight. Or he told him that he was in heart attack country and he needed to lose weight, which King proceeded to do quite grudgingly. And as with many of Stephen King's ideas, it sort of went from there, really. He began to ask himself, well, what if I had no control over losing this weight? What if I was forced to lose it and I continued losing it? Billy's not the only one to suffer in this tale. Lemke also curses the judge who lets Billy walk scot-free, and he also curses the police chief who turned a blind eye to the crime. But it's difficult to argue that this is some sort of revenge fantasy directed at racist white authorities when the idea for the story was rooted in animosity towards basic health advice. I mean, sure, Lemke and his family are afforded a moment where they express their grievances towards white men such as Billy and his ilk, but Lemke's disfigured features and the violence perpetrated by the family in the later stages of the book seems sort of designed to unnerve the reader enough that a kind of a false equivalence takes root. So we may not entirely agree with Lemke's retaliatory methods, but we understand why he's pursued this. And by spending all of our time in this book with Billy, we come to a place of understanding, or at least King is trying to bring us to a place of understanding, I think, when he inflicts his quote-unquote white man's curse on Lemke and his family, because he's been wasting away throughout this time, and we see that in excruciating detail, and we have a certain degree of sympathy for him when he reaches this point of desperation. In other words, I think there is an attempt to create a kind of a both sides narrative here, where we can't entirely condemn or condone either side in their actions, when in fact that sympathy ought to have been reserved far more for the Romani community with a far longer history of grievances than this rich white dude who is suffering because he got away for killing somebody, even if it was an accident. He was still responsible and he got away with it. So let's turn now to Matt Ruff's 2016 book Lovecraft Country. This is a book that really confounded my expectations. It's more a set of sort of interconnected, richly interwoven short stories, written again by a white guy, but which says something new and interesting, I think, about race relations in the Jim Crow era of the United States. It's very episodic in nature, so it's perhaps unsurprising that HBO have adapted this for a TV series which is coming out in 2020. And each of the tales is told from a different point of view. The first tale, which I think is one of the longest, if not the longest, focuses on Atticus Black as he tries to find his estranged father in a kind of remote and weird part of New England. And there he encounters a strange cult and a entity from another dimension. And this really sort of echoes the horror works of the author from which this book actually gets its name, H.P. Lovecraft. An echo which is acknowledged by Atticus himself, who is well versed in science fiction writing. There are other tales as well that draw on sort of gothic writing and hard sci-fi and some fantasy, all sort of interconnected through the characters who are either family or friends of this one particular family and the central antagonist. I think the key to Ruff's success in this book is that all of the viewpoint characters in Lovecraft Country are people of colour, where Lemke and his family are not only a marginalised community in Thinner, but are actually kept in the margins of the story, essentially. Instead, Ruff brings Atticus and his compatriots into the heart of the book, and so we read about their traumatic experiences as they're processing them for themselves. And I think that this immediacy really compounds the societal horrors that they experience, whether that is fleeing from gun-toting racists in a whites-only diner, or vividly recollecting the horrors of the massacre in Tulsa in 1921. I found these particular incidents of racist violence far more horrific than the supernatural subplots of the book, and I think that was deliberate on Ruff's part. But here's the thing, these characters are not victims. Atticus and Letitia and Ruby and all the other viewpoint characters we spend time with, they certainly don't take unnecessary risks, and in that sense they're quite pragmatic towards the risks that they face. But they're not looking to be saved, and they're not interested in compromising or negotiating in order to live a quiet life. When Letitia buys a house, for example, she digs in her heels, literally at one point, rather than be scared out of this property by the ghost which is haunting it, which clearly doesn't want her there. I mean, after all, as the very real hostile entities in the surrounding neighbourhood remind her, Letitia has been unwanted by people unlike her throughout her life, so this is really nothing new to her. And I think that her story and these relationships are complicated by the fact that Ruby, her half-sister, does flee the house, is scared away, but then later in the book she claims her own kind of power in a really brilliant reimagining of the Jekyll and Hyde tale. Lovecraft Country isn't a better book than Thinner just because it's cleverer, although it is cleverer. It's a better book because it explores race relations in the United States by centralizing the characters experiencing the prejudice. Rather than making vague references to oppression in Jim Crow era America, Matt Ruff appropriates existing horror tropes in order to explore the everyday horrors of racism. It's a brilliant approach, and it is one that was adopted more recently in film, in Jordan Peele's excellent Get Out, and currently it's something that you can see in Watchmen, which reappropriates superhero tropes to explore racism in the United States. So, is it possible for a white man to write about racism with sensitivity and understanding? I think Matt Ruff has shown that it is possible. It's not easy, but I think that he's really achieved something remarkable in this book. As a work of horror, I think it's a great horror book, but it is using horror in a very interesting way. I think that Lovecraft Country is fresh and interesting. So this video was a little bit different to my usual ones. It's a bit more of a kind of a video essay, I suppose, on a particular topic. If you liked it, then please give me a thumbs up, and do please subscribe to my video and show your support. I'd really appreciate it. And I'll see you soon. Bye.